Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Paul Ligeti, and I am the president of the Historical Society of West Windsor. Today, we're going to be talking about a neighborhood called Berrien City, which is West Windsor's first planned community. This lecture will probably last around 45 to 50 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session. However, until we get to the end, please mute your microphones if you haven't already done so, but do feel free to enter questions or comments using the Zoom's chat function at any time during this lecture. Now, a quick note about the Historical Society. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit founded in 1983 and run by your friends and neighbors who volunteer in their free time. The Historical Society manages the West Windsor History Museum off of Southfield Road. We have several historic farm buildings to explore, and I encourage you to visit us during our regular open houses. The first one of the year is Sunday on March 3rd, 2025, from 1 to 4 p.m. The Historical Society benefits the community in many ways, from free public events to student scholarships to history tours, lectures like this one, preservation initiatives, and much more. However, we simply can't do all of this without community support, so please consider donating or volunteering. To donate, just go to the link at the bottom of most of this presentation slides, including this one. Many of the Historical Society's activities cost our nonprofit money, frankly, and we rely almost entirely on private donations to operate. So if you care about local history and community, please consider donating. None of our volunteers, including myself, are paid, and 100% of proceeds go directly to the nonprofit. However, even more helpful than donating is volunteering. Now, volunteering is open to all neighbors, including adults and students in 8th grade and above. There are many opportunities, from museum tour guides to lecturers, preservation initiatives, archiving, publicity, fundraising, and more. Again, the volunteer sign-up link is at the bottom of most of this lecture slides. Now, a few years ago, the Historical Society published a full-length history book about West Windsor's history from the Ice Age to the present day. You can buy it at the link shown here or at many of the Historical Society's upcoming events. Now, the book is probably one of the best ways to understand the broad history of West Windsor, but of course the lectures we give, including this one, go into far more detail. 100% of the book's sale proceeds go to our nonprofit, so you'd also be helping us while learning about the broad, overarching history of West Windsor Township. The Historical Society has also begun to install cast metal history markers around town. They are American-made, very high quality, and designed to last decades with little maintenance. Each marker highlights the history and significance of local sites and villages, and we would like to have more up in the coming years, of course. However, because of how high quality they are, again, they're expensive. So again, I know I've mentioned this a few times. If you'd like to see more history markers around town, then please consider donating. You can see the sign here from Grover's Mill. We installed that back in 2023. It's only 2 years later, so of course it's still standing, but you can see the size is relatively large, gives good history information, and matches with the historical aesthetic of many of these communities. One of the signs we're currently working on designing is for Berrien City, and we've already met with the Berrien City Neighborhood Association to discuss. Again, please donate if you'd like to see more of these around town, and not just in Berrien City. Now let's begin by asking the question, what is Berrien City? Well, fundamentally, it was West Windsor's first planned community. At the time that it was built, just south of the train station, our township was an agricultural community with farmland stretching as far as the eye could see. In fact, West Windsor didn't really become the suburban municipality it is today until the late 20th century. Before that, it was all farmland in every direction. Now, there are various historic villages that did develop as far back as the 1700s, and this included names that you might be familiar with, such as Dutch Neck, or Grover's Mill, or Penn's Neck, or Clarksville, and more. However, these villages and hamlets all developed organically over time. In contrast, most, but not all, of the present-day Berrien City was deliberately planned from its very beginning. Now, Berrien City first developed as a working-class neighborhood south of the train station in the 1910s, which again we'll explore in future slides. Its homes are typically small to mid-sized and of varying ages. Some of them are well over 100 years old, while others are much younger. Some of them only are a few years old. Berrien City is also defined by its longtime businesses and community groups, including an art center, fire company, pizza shop, post office, shoe repair shop, and others at various points in time. And perhaps most importantly, Berrien City still has a strong sense of self-identity, and residents ardently support its historic character and charm. Now, here is an aerial map of Berrien City. I'm sure you'll all notice its proximity to the train station, Morris Hawk School, and the Acme/Worry Mart shopping complex. Now, look at the region within the dotted yellow line, so right around here. This is what the township's planning board and generally the residents recognize as Berrien City. You'll also note that this region is further subdivided into several different zones, represented by 4 different colors. We have blue, green, yellow, and dark gray. Well, 2 patches of dark gray. Now, why is that? Well, based off of old maps, deeds, and newspaper advertisements, it's clear that Berrien City, as we know it today, didn't start off as one cohesive development. Instead, it historically grew in several distinct parts. The 3 zones in blue, green, and yellow represent what I'm calling the 3 planned zones of Berrien City. What I mean by this is that these 3 zones were literally planned and advertised as distinct residential neighborhoods, each with its own name. For instance, the blue region was originally composed of 72 lots laid out all at once in 1916 and advertised to prospective homeowners and home buyers, as neighborhoods called Berrien Heights. The 2 yellow regions, in combination with the blue region, so all 3 of these together, were advertised in 1924 as a development called Berrien City. And the green region, right up here, from 1926, was planned and advertised as the distinct neighborhood called Princeton Gardens. Meanwhile, unlike these 3 planned zones, the lots within the dark gray regions, so over here and over here, weren't developed under a pre-planned neighborhood scheme. Instead, the local farmers happened to sell the land piece by piece to different families, and as a result, the dark gray zones grew more organically. However, much of this did happen to take place simultaneous to the development of the planned zones, resulting in very similar streetscapes, similar lot sizes, house sizes, and even distribution of home ages. So it's no wonder why everything within the dotted yellow region is today considered part of an interconnected neighborhood that we put under the umbrella term of Berrien City. Now, before we delve into the neighborhood, I want to take a step back and emphasize its broader context, that of a region called Princeton Junction. I'm sure that all of you probably recognize the name, Princeton Junction. For residents who moved here within the last 25 years, you might only think of it as the 08550 zip code, which covers most of West Windsor. However, I want to emphasize that that's a much more modern definition, and the term Princeton Junction is actually much older than the zip code that bears its name. Now, back in the original Princeton Junction in its purest form was literally the junction or intersection of 2 railroads. These 2 railroads are the present-day Northeast Corridor and the Princeton Branch Railroad, otherwise known as the Dinky Line, connecting us to Princeton. Both train lines, as well as the train station, date back to the mid-1860s, and thus the term Princeton Junction also dates back to the mid-1860s. In the decades that followed the train station's construction, a community, also called Princeton Junction, formed around the train station, profiting from easy access to transportation, including the shipping of industrial and agricultural products. Now, Princeton Junction's original residential and community core, original residential and community core was along Station Drive on the northwest side of the train track. So you can see that right over here. This is directly opposite of the power station and kind of where the Wallace Road intersects with Princeton Heightstown Road. Now, again, that was the original residential and community core. That being said, And along this core, there are some original 1800s era buildings which still stand even at the time of this lecture. Again, the date is February 20th, 2025. For instance, you have the High Store and Post Office. It's a 1800s era general store and post office, which is now the Asian Bistro residence. Longer time residents may also recall it being Good Friends or Peking Express before. There's also Dewey's Upholstery, which was an 1800s era warehouse. Princeton Junction over time did grow, of course, and expand significantly to encompass basically everything seen in this picture and beyond. Now, this expansion included Berrien City in the lower center portion of the screen, which became Princeton Junction's primary residential core. Now, in the next slide, we see the Princeton Junction train station sometime between 1863 and 1876. Note the farmland on either side of the train tracks, as well as the forest on either side of the train tracks in this photo. Of course, now it's all almost entirely parking lots, but over here on the left and on the right, you can see the farmland and woods in the 1800s. And again, this was the general landscape of West Windsor at the time. In the far distance on the left is the future site of Berrien City, which would not be built for another 40 to 50 years after this photo was taken. Now, the land that would become Berrien City was originally mostly farmland and woods, but not entirely. That's because some parts were actually part of a garden center called Elliott Nursery. In 1840, a former blacksmith named William Elliott founded a nursery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The business passed through the family, and in 1889, William's grandson, James Wilkinson Elliott, established his own nursery firm in Pittsburgh. James's relationships with the celebrities of his time and his savvy marketing skills made his business a success. His advertisements were featured in prestigious magazines such as National Geographic, and his company gained nationwide recognition. He was even actually close friends with someone named James Walter Thompson, who most people don't know of today, but in his time, he was one of the most influential advertisers in American history. And to that end, we return to Berrien City. Because Elliott Nursery's products were in such demand, from flowers to shrubs to trees and more, they branched out, pun intended, to locations outside of Pittsburgh. From 1912 to 1919, Elliott Nursery operated a distribution center next to the train tracks in Princeton Junction. They sold trees and shrubs, and may have constructed the pond at the train station as well, where the car drop-off loop is right in front of the ticket building. It's possible that Elliott Nursery products still grow in some West Windsor backyards, including potentially trees in Berrien City. Again, this is speculation, so we're not quite sure. Now, the decade following World War I was a period of growth for America. Technological innovations and economic prosperity saw more and more people moving to the growing suburbs as increasingly affordable automobiles helped people to thrive further away from city centers. Of course, the train station, too, certainly helped in growing the area. So it's no wonder that Berrien City began to develop in the 1910s and 1920s and beyond, and attracted a growing number of working class and middle class families to the area. Now, some of these early residents literally worked on the railroad, and many others used it to commute into New York or Philadelphia. And this leads us to the origin of Berrien City. Again, I want to reiterate that Berrien City originally developed in several distinct parts. There is a core of 3 deliberately planned and deliberately named neighborhoods, which are pictured here, as well as a periphery of equally old and similarly sized houses and lots nearby on Alexander Road and Harris Road. Now, this map does not show Berrien City exactly as it exists today. Instead, it shows the original concept plans for the 3 planned zones, much of which was developed as laid out here, but much of which, I'm sure you notice, was clearly not built at all. The earliest of these is the area in blue. It was called Berrien Heights, originally consisting of 72 lots laid out in 1916 by a man named Scott Berrien. After it came Berrien City, which is a combination of newer lots in yellow laid out in 1924, as well as the original lots in the blue portion. So all 3 sections together, yellow, yellow, and blue. And in 1926 was Michael McLaughlin's Princeton Gardens, which, as you can see here, was originally planned to be a significantly larger development on either side of the railroad tracks, but of course was ultimately only built southeast of the railroad along Wallace Road, Scott Avenue, and Barrasco Place. So nothing on this side of the railroad tracks was built. It was only this section and a little section over here along Emil Street, although those houses are much, much, much newer. This section down here never ended up getting built. Now, originally, again, it also did include Emil Street off of North Post Road, but those houses are only a few decades old at most, and it's all separated from the rest of Berrien City, so many residents don't really consider it part of the neighborhood. So again, there was a lot that was planned and did come to pass, but a lot that never ended up being developed in the Princeton Gardens area. In all three planned developments, the developers sold empty lots of land, and the buyers themselves were responsible for building their own houses. And this is important to note because it's one of the reasons why the development kind of grew over time as opposed to all being built at once. And it's also a reason why there's a lot of architectural diversity within Berrien City. Now, let's go into more detail. As I'd mentioned, the earliest section was called Berrien Heights. This development, again, the blue section in this picture, now this development, Berrien Heights, was developed by a man named on paper as Scott Berrien. However, I actually suspect that this was a man whose full name was Montgomery Scott Berrien, since the other Scott Berriens who lived in the area died either before 1916 or didn't own nearly as much land in West Windsor if they owned land at all. Again, Berrien Heights was originally 72 uniform lots laid out along Montgomery Street and Berrien Avenue, and pictured as one of my favorite houses in Berrien Heights, which for many years belonged to the Service family. Next, we have Berrien City. This was established in 1924 by Montgomery's son, Alexander. His development was 114 lots and included the original 72 lots of Berrien Heights, plus several dozen additional lots along Scott Avenue and Lily Street. At least some, if not all, of the original deeds for Berrien City required that new homes be worth at least $2,000. Alexander was also known as Judge. He was nicknamed Judge to his friends because he was a justice of the peace. And apparently he and much of the rest of his family and in-laws also lived in Berrien City during its early years. After Alexander died in 1924, his son, Alexander Jr., who I believe also lived here, managed the neighborhood's development. Now, obviously, today we consider the entire general region of the neighborhood to be Berrien City, including the three planned regions as well as the unplanned zones. And I'm not quite sure when all of the planned and unplanned portions began to all just assume the name Berrien City, but I know it was many, many years ago. Next, we have Princeton Gardens, which developed in 1926, or 99 years ago at the time of this recording. Its original 201 lots were laid out in 1926 by Michael McLaughlin and Macro Realty on either side of the train tracks. However, as we previously mentioned, only a portion of this was built, and all of that southeast of the train tracks. Pictured here was the Showcase Princeton Gardens house at the corner of Scott and Wallace Roads. Scott Avenue and Wallace Roads. It probably has the biggest lawn out of any in the entire neighborhood. Now, Princeton Gardens had a number of restrictions in its early years, and keep in mind that this was in the 1920s, well before the zoning board was formed in 1944. For instance, you see that no posters or billboards were allowed. And I assume that this was put in place because people were already complaining about all the billboards at the train around the train station at the time. You'll also notice that there are restrictions on the type of dwellings that could be constructed, minimum frontages and setbacks, maximum fence heights, maximum garage sizes, no flat roofs, and minimum prices on homes and garages. And all of this was relatively benign. However, there was one more restriction that was significantly more sinister, that of racial discrimination. Now, the text you see on the screen with the white background is taken word for word from one of the original 1920s era deeds for a house in Princeton Gardens. It says basically that no one who's not white could live in the house in this specific property except for servants employed by the white homeowners. Now, I don't know whether this same clause existed for all the 1920s era Princeton Garden houses or if it was just this one or several of them. But obviously, even one house is terrible and reflects a broader trend of racism and housing discrimination that pervaded the entire United States for generations. West Windsor was not free of that sin. Now, finally, let's talk about the origins of the unplanned portions of Berrien City. Again, as mentioned, Harris Road and Alexander Road became associated with Berrien City decades ago. Even though they were not originally part of the three planned developments, their proximity and similar home ages and sizes, street environments, and lot sizes make them a clear extension. Pictured is 100 Harris Road, for instance, which according to tax records dates back to 1935. So congrats on its 90th birthday. So I've been mentioning all sorts of street names, but where specifically do they come from? Well, most, but not all, come from the Berrien family itself. Montgomery Avenue, Scott Avenue, and Berrien Avenue were presumably named after Montgomery Scott Berrien. Alexander Road gets its name from Alexander Berrien. Lilly Street is named after Lillian, who was Alexander's sister, or Montgomery's daughter. And ML Street is named after ML Lute, who was Lillian's husband, or Alexander's brother-in-law. However, not every street references the Berrien family or their in-laws. For instance, Borrasco Place is named after the Borrasco family, who lived there in the 1920s and possibly earlier, and who, according to the 1920 census, were of Hungarian origin. And I'm pointing that out just because a significant portion of my family is also Hungarian. And as for Wallace Road, that actually remains a mystery even to me. So if anyone else happens to know, please contact me because we'd certainly like to get that documented. Now, as I'd mentioned, one unique element of the entirety of Berrien City is its architectural diversity. This diversity can be attributed to two primary reasons. First is the fact that, as mentioned, individual homeowners purchased empty lots of land and constructed their own homes, and this, of course, yielded much more creative expression than a community whose houses were constructed by a single developer, such as Toll Brothers. But in addition to this, Berrien City's houses were not all constructed at once. Instead, the earliest houses were indeed built in the 1910s and 1920s, and according to tax records, there may be some older ones, but if there are, then there's only one or two. However, many of the lots didn't have houses built until the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or even later. And again, some of them I believe, are only a few years old. So, because of these two reasons, individual families building their own homes and the variations in house age, there is a cornucopia of architectural styles. You have Cape Cods, American four squares, bungalows, simple gable front, eclectic and ranch, pictured here. However, there's also Tudor Revival, split level, minimal traditional, Dutch colonial, and more. One Berrien City resident, Susan Abbey, published a wonderful architectural styles guideline last year, which details how to distinguish these architectural styles from one another and their decades of significance. It also provides recommendations as to how to alter homes, or if you're doing renovations, how to keep it relatively true and respectful of the original architecture and the scale of the neighborhood. The Historical Society now has a copy of this guide, so thank you to Susan. Now, many of these early houses were constructed by professional builders, but not all. Many of the brick houses, for instance, are credited to Charles Aversano, an early resident, and the cement block and stucco houses are credited to the Hall family. Several other neighbors, friends, railroad construction crews, let me backtrack. Several other houses were built from home kits purchased from Sears, Roebuck, and other companies. And sometimes neighbors, friends, railroad construction crews, and even neighborhood children help with the actual construction, emphasizing the sense of community here. And in remodeling their homes, some later residents have found building materials from the railroad used in the structure of the house itself, such as packing crates or literal railroad tracks holding up, for example, a basement being used as a beam. Especially during the 1930s and 1940s, building materials were hard to come by due to, the Great Depression and World War II, so people used what they could. And in the backyards of many houses, families have found buried jars of preserved tomatoes, old bottles, and pieces of glass and pottery. It seems that Berrien City's earliest residents sometimes buried their unburnable trash in the ground in the days long before West Windsor had a municipal dump and regular trash collection. So I'm not encouraging anyone to dig up their yards, right after this lecture, but if you do happen to do so, you might find some interesting things. Now, the following slide right here shows a map of home age distributions in Berrien City. Now, the map is derived from 2019 West Windsor Township tax records. And because of the methodology of how tax records are kept, and especially because tax records sometimes, when a home experiences a major renovation or expansion, the tax record is going to list that date as the date of construction rather than the original date of construction. So, as a result, there may be some inaccuracy here to the age of homes in the area. However, it should be mostly correct. And the reason I'm showing this slide is because I want to to present the idea that Berrien City's age distribution is somewhat randomized throughout the city. There's no one huge concentration of older homes in one specific area. Rather, the ages of homes are more or less spread out randomly throughout the neighborhood. One thing I'll also point out is right here, you can see the text that says Crawford Woods. I see that on Google Maps, and I was wondering what that was, so I did some research. And there was a man named Franklin Crawford who owned the property, and then he sold it to the township a number of, I believe, in the 1990s, maybe more recently, but he sold it a number of years ago, and therefore it has his name as well. And Crawford Woods, again, more or less separates the Harris Road area / Alexander Road area from the rest of Berrien City. Now, if we go on to the next slide, we can talk about Berrien City's community organizations. One of the earliest and most significant was, of course, the Princeton Junction Volunteer Fire Company. And the fire company originally formed in 1926 as the Berrien City Fire Company. However, by the next year, they had changed their name to the Princeton Junction Volunteer Fire Company. I've heard that in its earliest years, the fire company used someone's house on Berrien Avenue as its original firehouse, and for some time, another building on Station Drive across the train tracks as well. However, in 1930, they purchased 2 lots off of Alexander Road, and the next year formally opened their firehouse pictured here. Before I go on to the next slide, I do want to point out, you're probably wondering about this alien sculpture. Nowadays, the old firehouse, and I'm going to describe this in more detail later, but nowadays the firehouse is used as an arts council, an arts center for the West Windsor Arts Council, now known as West Windsor Arts. And in 2018, they installed this sculpture. It's called Scout Ship. It's by an artist named, I believe, Eric Schultz. And it's an homage to the Orson Welles' infamous 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast, which put West Windsor in the national spotlight as the site of a fake alien invasion. And we've done other lectures and tours about that specifically. It's one of West Windsor's claim to fame. The sculpture technically isn't standing directly here anymore. Instead, it was moved a few dozen feet over to the west, so in this direction. But it still stands on the property generally. Now, here are the 2 of the earliest fire trucks of the Princeton Junction Fire Company in front of the firehouse. The first fire engine on the right was a foamite chemical truck purchased for about $3,900. Funds for some of the first engines, as well as the station itself, were partly raised by dances on the Princeton Community Club on Route 1, as well as bingo games, which were especially popular during the Great Depression, but which also persisted for many decades thereafter. And during World War II, the firehouse served as a civil defense station, offering medical supplies, public emergency lessons, and general equipment for wartime emergencies. Of course, the fire company has responded to thousands, if not tens of thousands, of fires during its 99 years of existence. Pictured is a fire off of Route 1, I believe of the old Princeton bowling and ice rink where the Pep Boys now stands. Of course, the fire company also responds to general emergencies and provides invaluable education and other resources and support for the community more broadly. So before I continue, I just do want to say thank you to them and to all of West Windsor's emergency service volunteers and staff. And also thank you to Dennis and Gay Huber for providing the fire company photos. Now, the fire company, like some other local organizations, was originally restricted to only male volunteers. While they were supplemented by a group called the Women's Auxiliary, which raised funds, held events, and provided general support, the women were not originally firefighters themselves. Happily, this began to change in the 1970s when women began serving as part of the team, and now they're fully contributing members as well, driving trucks, fighting fires, etc. But as a result, the Women's Auxiliary was written out of the company's constitution long ago. Now, I don't know when this picture was taken, but I'm posting it as an example of the fire company in front of the old firehouse. It's interesting to see all the equipment on the trucks, and I'm sure that some people within the audience can recognize some of the people pictured here. And the next slide shows another view, as well as the building before the siren was installed. So you notice it's blank at the very top, whereas there is a siren now. Now, the original portion of the building was simply the portion below the stepped roof. So everything below this area, below the stepped roof. However, throughout the 20th century, West Windsor grew, and as a result, the fire company needed to expand as well and needed more space. So they built additional wings, which you can see on the right, or the the west side of the building, in the mid 20th century and beyond. Another interesting set of photos are those of the fire company circuses. In the 1970s, the fire company brought the Hoaxie Brothers Circus into town, which of course became a popular attraction, especially for kids. I'm sure that some of the township's longtime residents remember performances, snacks, and fun for all. And I'm guessing that these were the only times that elephants were ever spotted in West Windsor, let alone photographed. Now, starting in the late 1950s, West Windsor's population began to grow. This was relatively steady throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and part of the 1970s, but especially in the 1980s and 1990s, this growth really accelerated, turning our agricultural community of a few thousand people into a bustling suburban municipality of well over 30,000 residents. Of course, as a result, the Princeton Junction Volunteer Fire Company needed to grow as well to meet increased demand for emergency services. However, the old Berrien City firehouse was too small to adequately accommodate this. So in 2002, the fire company relocated to a new facility off of Clarksville Road next to the municipal center. But they still used the old building in Berrien City for trucks and equipment storage. Now, when the company left the old fire station, it resulted in the question, who would take their place? Well, it turns out it was another community group, and thank you to Eileen Green, Executive Director of West Windsor Arts, for the photo. In 2002, the same year the fire company moved out, local citizens and Mayor Xing Fouché convened a task force with the goal to reinvigorate the building into an arts center. After years of hard work, planning, and fundraising by the community, the building formally opened as an arts and culture hub. For the past 15 years, with the exception of COVID, a nonprofit now called West Windsor Arts, previously known as the West Windsor Arts Council, has hosted regular classes and workshops, exhibitions, dances, community get-togethers, and more. The Historical Society regularly collaborates with them on projects and programs. In fact, we have a few coming up this year, so stay tuned. Now, the old firehouse is not the only longtime institution in Berrien City. Another one stands right next door at 948 Alexander Road. Originally, the building in question looked like this. We don't know the exact year it was built, but I've heard it was originally a general store or grocery store of some sort, but I unfortunately don't even know the decade. However, what I do know is that in the 1940s, the Princeton Junction post office moved here and stayed here until 1970, when it further relocated to Princeton Hightstown Road, and then eventually further to the municipal center in the 1990s. In 1966, the Watlington family purchased the property, and although I could be wrong, I presume that it's around this time that they opened a hole in the wall called Howard's Luncheonette in the one-story addition on the left. Residents could grab a meal and buy a little bit of everything, including penny candy for children. In the mid-1970s, the Galetta family purchased the property, and a few years later they expanded the same building to become what it looks like today, which you can see in the picture here. Cooking had been an integral fact of life for the family, stretching back generations into their origins in Italy. Similarly, in the Berrien City location, they opened an Italian eatery in this building. The restaurant was a local staple for many years and continued to thrive throughout the late 1980s. It was replaced by Brothers Pizza, which operates out of the building to this day. And directly next to Brothers Pizza is yet another familiar sight to many of you, I'm sure, Sal's Shoe Repair Shop. The store at 1 Berrien Avenue was founded by Salvatore Balistrieri in 1977. He was born in 1924 in Napoli, Italy, and immigrated to the United States in 1954. 12 years later, Sal married Maria Di Meglio, a fellow Italian transplant. She had been employed as a professional seamstress in Italy, and meanwhile, shortly after immigrating, Sal was employed as a custodian at Princeton University, where he worked for many years. In 1977, he opened his shoe repair store in Berrien City. Although the business carried his name, it was really a family affair, with Maria attending to the shop when Sal was working in Princeton. They also repaired other leather items beyond shoes, such as handbags and hats and more. Sal and Maria eventually passed away a number of years ago. I don't know, and unfortunately, I never got to know them. Now, I did get to know their son to some extent. His name was Luigi, who took over the business after his parents passed. But I was sad to hear that he also passed last year. I don't know what the future has in store for the shop as a result, but regardless, at least for now, it still stands as a longtime community icon. Now, I do want to note that there are a few other local businesses. For instance, I've been told about a watchmaker who operated out of his house many years ago. And I actually see in the comments, let me see, we have it right here. So thank you to Cheryl, that Harold Fleming repaired watches for years on Scott Avenue, so that we're probably talking about the same person. I'm also aware of the grocery store that was founded by Fred Hall as far back as the 1920s in Berrien City. Now, I'm not sure if that's the same building as Howard's Luncheonette / Galetta's Galley / Brothers Pizza or not, or if it was a different building. And of course, others currently have their own home businesses. For example, you have artists, you have people who design signs, for instance. And what I want to emphasize that it's not just the houses themselves and the buildings themselves that make Berrien City what it is. Of course, it's the enterprises too and the people. Now, the reason that I'm highlighting this building is because I'm not actually quite sure what it is. I do know that this building, the photograph was taken in 1992, I believe 1992, by Joe Ryan, who grew up in the area. And this building was at the intersection of Wallace Road and Alexander Road. Today, it's roughly where the exit from the Wallace Road parking lot is onto Wallace Road itself. I don't know the year it was built, but its design makes it seem almost commercial as well as residential. So if anyone happens to know what this building is, please post it in the chat, or we can talk about it at the end of this lecture, the question and answer section, or if you want, you can email us as well. Now, another important part of Berrien City's history is its access to water. Today, houses are fed underground through pipes and connected to municipal water. However, this wasn't always the case. In the early days, residents could get water from a freshwater spring near the foot of Wallace Road and Scott Avenue. The water coming from an open spigot was apparently pure and clean enough that nearby residents filled jugs for drinking. I've been told that the spring was capped in the 1970s when the water became polluted. However, there were also two other more formal wells. One of them, which is pictured here, was drilled at the corner of Scott Avenue and Montgomery Streets. I've been told that there was a water tower, but it was often insufficiently sized and overflowed. Another well at the foot of Scott Avenue and Wallace Road was drilled in 1955 and was operated by Berrien City's own water company. This company was sold to Elizabethtown Water in 1968. Now, of course, I can't talk about Berrien City without talking about two of its most famous residents. The first is someone that many of you probably immediately recognize. His name was John Forbes Nash, Jr. Born in 1928 in West Virginia, Nash graduated from what is now known as Carnegie Mellon University, which I'm an alumnus of as well, followed by Princeton University. He was a mathematical genius and earned his PhD in 1950 with a dissertation on non-cooperative games. He also made contributions to singularity theory, geometry, and much more, and even predicted many contemporary cryptographic concepts. Nash is also well known for his decades-long struggles with schizophrenia, which, along with his eventual partial recovery, were the subject of a book and a movie called A Beautiful Mind. Now, in 1994, Nash received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences based on his contributions to game theory, which explores decision-making and has tremendously broad uses. And that's one thing I want to highlight. I'm not sure if there are other West Windsor residents who have Nobel Prizes. Obviously, it's an incredibly prestigious award, one of the most prestigious in the world. But if there are other West Windsor residents who have Nobel Prizes, please let me know because I would love to have that recorded as well in West Windsor's history. Now, again, he won the Nobel Prize in 1994, and the next year he became a senior research mathematician at Princeton University. He won a variety of other distinctions over the years, including the Abel Prize, one of mathematics, I think it might be mathematics' very highest award in 2015. The reason that I'm highlighting Nash is, of course, he lived in Berrien City. He took the Nikki line to work in Princeton and was a familiar face in both towns. I know residents who said, "Oh, I remember sitting next to him or noticing him eat at Al John's, just a few minutes away." People saying all over that they remember him being in West Windsor. Kind of remember him as this figure who was generally in the area and living in Berrien City. And Nash Park as well, which is an open air park across the road from the old Acme/Worry shopping center, is also named after him. Sadly, he and his wife Alicia passed away in a car crash in 2015. However, his contributions to economics and math live on. Now, I'm sure that many of you also know that a globally recognized actor also grew up in Berrien City. Pictured is the actor Ethan Hawke during his younger years here. Ethan and his mother moved to Berrien City in 1981 when he was 10 years old. He spent much of his boyhood in West Windsor, in the West Windsor Plainsboro school system. He played on local sports teams and worked at places like Thomas Sweet's Ice Cream Parlor in Princeton. And of course, he made many friends in town, some of whom may still know him today. When Ethan was 12, he acted in an adaptation of Meet Me in St. Louis in High School South's auditorium. You might better know High School South as the West Windsor Plainsboro High School if you grew up in West Windsor before High School North opened in Plainsboro in 1997. Ethan Hawke also starred in many other local roles as well, including after he transferred to Princeton's Hun School in 10th grade. Ethan made his professional stage debut at 13 years old at Princeton's McCarter Theater and acted in several more McCarter plays for the next few years. Now, Ethan Hawke made his professional film debut in 1985. At first, the films that he starred in were not big hits, but he skyrocketed to fame in 1989 after he starred alongside Robin Williams, on the left, in the critically acclaimed coming-of-age drama Dead Poets Society. 2 years later, Ethan had his first leading role in White Fang. Over the decades, his star has continued to grow. He's been nominated for Academy Awards, Golden Globes, won Tony, and numerous other honors, some of which he has won. His daughter, Maya Hawke, is now a celebrity actress in her own right, most famous for her role in the hit Netflix show Stranger Things. Ethan Hawke's family sold their West Windsor house several decades ago. However, the fact that a globally recognized actor had his formative years in our town is immutable. Now, in the next slide, one reason I want to highlight this is because of the fact that there's two Alexander Roads, which is kind of interesting to me. Now, the original Alexander Road extended along this way, and you can actually see its continuation here. And there's a few houses that still stand that have the driveways off of there. There was a bridge that more or less started here and went over the railroad tracks over onto the other side of the tracks. However, eventually that bridge became old and the T intersection on this side was relatively dangerous, so it needed to be replaced. And the conversations about replacing it were everyone had a different opinion, partly because discussions also centered around whether or not the bridge should be moved. And if a new bridge is built, should it be further down North Post? Should it be closer to the intersection of Wallace and Alexander? But ultimately, the decision was made to construct a bridge more or less in the same location. But as a result, a second Alexander Road, the current Alexander Road, was constructed and leads to this bridge here, which has a roundabout, which again goes over the train tracks. This was constructed, I believe, around the year 2008. To me, it's just interesting that there's an old Alexander Road and a new Alexander Road. So now, before I end the lecture, I want to take a kind of a reflective look at Berrien City today. One thing to emphasize is just how much it's grown. From just a dozen or so houses in the 1910s to probably around 130, 140 today. Whereas the original residents were railroad workers and farmers and secretaries, now many residents work in software or on Wall Street or are doctors or engineers or artists, teachers, and much more. Whereas the homes were worth maybe $2,000 at first, now you have homes worth $500,000, 600,000, 700, 800,000. And of course, traffic is heavier, and some of the community businesses and nonprofits have changed. And also, although I don't have demographic statistics specific to the neighborhood, I have to imagine that it at least partially diversified along racial and religious lines compared to its earliest years. Yet, in other ways, Berrien City has kept to its roots. The houses and lot sizes, for one, are much the way that they were 50 and even 100 years ago. However, I do know that a few houses have crept in over the years that break this mold, and it's a constant struggle for the community to maintain the architectural and historical character. To that end, I'm happy to see more discussion about its history and maintaining the charm of the neighborhood in recent years. And of course, the proximity to the train station is still a draw for many, as is the sense of neighborhood and the sense of neighbors knowing one another, the same as it was all those many generations ago. Now, that is the end of this lecture, and I'm about to open it up for questions and answers. But before I do so, I do want to emphasize a few things. First and foremost, you may have noticed that I didn't have many old photos shown of Berrien City. Frankly, that's because we actually don't have that many to begin with, and in general, as a historical society of Berrien City. So if any of you happen to have any old photos, please contact us because we'd love to get them documented and have photocopies put into the archives so we can continue preserving Berrien City's history and tell more of its story. Now, I want to talk about the links on this page. I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. At the bottom of the screen, you see a link and QR code to the West Windsor History book, which you can purchase to learn much more about the broad arc of our township's rich history, everything from the Ice Age to the present day. In the middle is our link to our volunteer and donate link and QR code, and I strongly urge you all to please, please, please volunteer. We're a small nonprofit community group, fully composed of volunteers, and we're always looking for interested community members to join us. And finally, the top link out of the three is the Historical Society's website, specifically the web page where you can learn more about Berrien City's history. We will post this lecture recording there permanently, so you can always refer back to it. Now, with that being said, I'm happy to take any questions or comments, and you can post it in the chat or unmute yourselves and feel free to ask. Thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. Appreciate it.
This is Rick Engel. May I speak about something?
Yes. Hi, Rick. How are you doing?
Good to see you. Thank you. I don't know if people remember that have been around long enough, and I've been in West Windsor since 1981, that there was a family named the Butlers who ran a farm market, so to speak, out of their garage there on Alexander. So it's sort of a part of the Berrien City. If you turn right off the circle, it's about the second, maybe the first house on the right.
So, you're talking about the circle on the railroad bridge, right?
You come over from the Princeton Way, go over the
Okay.
circle, go right on North Post,
Mhm.
right? And there's a house that may be the first house, I'm not sure, but there's a garage that's unattached to it. And they used to, well, every summer they would run a farm market out of their garage for years, the Butlers.
Yeah. How long was that? How long ago was that? I don't personally remember that, so that's
Well,
why
that
I'm.
was in the 80s that I went.
Well,
Somebody else has got an idea here.
yeah. I know Eileen Dube mentioned that she used to remember buying fresh veggies there, so that's interesting to hear. Again, these remnants of kind of when West Windsor is more of an agricultural town. Yeah. And then Bob, I noticed that you raised your hand as well. If you want, I can. Yes. Hi.
Audio.
There we go. Now I can hear you.
Yeah. We moved in 1973 and lived on Monterey Drive for 50 years, which Monterey Drive is in Benford Estates, which abuts onto Berrien City.
Mhm.
The Butlers lived as you come down the hill from now it's a roundabout. Before that, it was a demolition derby with a T intersection. Um, and as you come down that hill, they were the first on the right. It's still there today. I think they may have enhanced the garage a little bit, but the house is essentially the size that it was
Mhm.
in 1973.
Mhm.
And
Oh, yeah.
a couple of houses have been added along there, right along the tracks
Mhm.
since then.
Yeah.
The house
The
that the house that you showed there on would be Alexander as it makes the curve into Berrien City, um, with the stairs going up the side. Um, there was a couple houses in there, and then when they started to enlarge the parking lots for the train station, the people who owned the house, and I don't remember who it was then, did not want to sell the house. So eventually the parking lots got built, except for this one little plot of land with that house on it. And eventually that lasted probably for another 15 years after that. And um, then and now it's just kind of a little mound there as you start to go up the hill for for the roundabout.
so
But
a few things. First, I'll mention that I actually the first 5 years of my life I lived on Monterey as well. I was at Four Monterey. Um, and that house at if you're talking about the one at Wallace and Alexander. I think I've been told that it was
yeah,
owned by the Hall family. Is that familiar?
that could be.
Okay.
There were halls in the neighborhood, or I mean, a family named Hall. The Butlers were there when we got there in 1973. I mean,
Mhm.
into Princeton Junction. Um, and at that point, the station was not the station that's there now. It was an older station, and that was replaced probably in the 80s.
Mhm.
Um, but the old station was one of the classic old stations. Being a train person, I hated to see it torn down. But there was at that point, Princeton Junction was the second busiest station in New Jersey. So Newark was the only one that had more train traffic.
The that house at Wallace and Alexander, by the way, the other thing I'm wondering about it, was it just a house or was it more to that originally? Because
You mean the Butlers or?
the one that might have been owned by the Halls, because just the cinder block,
Oh,
the fact that it looked very commercial, if I'm looking at
it,
it. So,
yeah. When we moved in '73, there was no business that I remember
mhm.
there. Um, I mean, it was clearly a residence. If there was a business in there with it or not, I don't remember any. There may have been right before, '73,
Mhm.
but yeah, and there was no train uh, parking lot on the other side of the tracks. It was all on the junction side.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm sorry, there was a small one over there where because at that point, Dewey's was there, and there was an auto repair shop, and the Chinese restaurant was there. Trying to think what else was in there, and there were a couple of postage stamp lots that people could park in. But there was already a long waiting list in '73 for parking at the train station.
Oh yeah.
So I was lucky because living on Monterey, I could walk to the station, and there were many of us that did that, and a few rode bicycles from Monterey over to the station. They had an old style bike rack there.
Now I noticed that David Mostello, you asked to unmute, so or raise your hand. So if you have a question. Oh, sorry, Ella, do you have a question? Because after David, I'll.
I was going to add to the water tower information. I think you have some of this on the website, if I remember correctly. There was a Berrien City water company, and Mr. Krebs, who lived on Alexander Road, managed that and turned off the water when it would overflow. It was $5 a share to have the water. That I remember. That pump no longer functions. When I first moved here 25 years ago, I replaced the pump hoping that it could work. It no longer reaches water. And I sit on the capped water tower that is in my basement.
It's literally inside.
Inside. It
Very
stands
interesting.
stands maybe 36 inches. It was Mr. Krebs who saw me at my first Berrien City meeting, and he said, "I bet you want to know what that is in your basement." And I said, "No one has been able to tell me what it is." He was the one that said, "It's the capped water tower."
That's interesting because okay, that kind of answers one of my questions because I'd been told there was a water tower, right? And I'm looking at old aerial photographs of Berrien City, and I just cannot for the life of me find that water tower because I'm looking right where the pump is. But you're saying it was kind of in a
So
adjacent
let's
property?
see. It was there. I'm trying to do the quick math in my head. It was there probably 65, 65 or 67 years ago because
Mhm.
I grew up in Hopewell and we used to go to Surf City every summer. I can hear my parents saying, "Remember, when we see the water tower, we're almost home." And here I sit. So it was there until, uh, let's see, we stopped going down there just before I was a teenager. That's the only timeline I have for how when it was up.
Yeah, water generally was a problem when I moved in 73. I mean, in the neighborhood, it was that was before sewers, and when we got a healthy rain, a good part of the at least Benford Estates and probably most of Berrien City was you know had sitting water in it.
Well, when you walk the streets of Berrien City, you'll see that most homes have drain pipes coming to the street.
Yeah.
So David, I think you also had a question too.
Yes, I would like to enlighten your audience about the train station. The original train station burned down in December 1950, and apparently it was replaced with the classic building that somebody referred to, and eventually that was torn down and replaced with the current station in 1987.
Yeah, I remember that it was in the late 80s. Yeah.
The original train station had a station master living quarters on the second floor
Yep.
and everything like that.
Yeah, and I've heard about that. I know that that burned down. Yeah, like a six-bedroom apartment on top. We also got
Yeah.
another. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Uh, no, I don't have anything else to say.
Okay. We also got another question: how many buildings had existed on the current parking lot spaces? And I'm assuming that's referring to the Wallace Road lot. The one that I'd
Yes.
shown that I'm wondering about, I think was that the only one? Because that's the only one that I'm aware of.
Well, there was on both sides of Wallace Road. Now, where the ranches are now, there were some ranches on the other side, and they planted those rows of evergreens after they took them out on the east on the west side.
Mhm.
Um, but there were no houses any closer to the tracks until you got on the other side of what is now the roundabout. And then down as you went down the hill, then they had the row of houses that went up North Post and around the curve on that side. Gradually, the houses were taken down. The last one was used by the police just before you got to the library. There was a house in there, a ranch house that the police used to use. I think they had their own little fitness center in there. And you used to see cars parked in. There was a ranch house in the trees. And of course, the library wasn't there then either. The
This
library came later, at least for me anyway.
this was after the corner, after you rounded the corner, coming from the bridge, or before?
If you come down from the roundabout and then back up the hill again, there were houses all along there. There's a few, like the Butlers and them, is still there now, but
Mhm.
there's a few that were out, and there was a couple houses in those woods on the west side going
Mhm.
around the curve.
Right.
But the library was not where the library is now. It was not a library. It was just a grass field.
Yeah, I think that was the Courtney family's farm over there. We have some of the deeds, and we had a family member reach out to us about a year and a half ago about that farm. And I know that's why we have Courtney Drive, in
Yeah,
Bedford
Courtney,
Estates.
the other side of Courtney Drive is Library Place or whatever it's called, Library Drive or something.
Yeah, a good friend of mine grew up on that farm there
Mhm.
uh, that you're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah.
she lives in Alabama now.
And the houses on Courtney were built in around, the house we lived in was built in 69, was complete in 69. And so houses on Courtney were in that same range, 68,
Mhm.
69.
Yeah, hi Cheryl.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Um, Cheryl Ellsworth. I'm an original, 1950, born and raised in Berrien City. I'm not sure if you're aware that where the original firehouse was, where the parking lot is now for that art center, there was a house there.
Mhm.
And that house was moved to North Post Road and still stands today.
Which I've heard it was moved. I don't, but I'm not aware which house is it. I didn't know if it was still standing or not. So
It
that's
is. It's a yellow house, and I'd have to drive by and look at what the address is. But yeah, because the Walkers used to own it, and we used to play in that house a lot. And then it got sold to the firehouse. And we used to have a bookmobile come because we didn't have a library. So every week a
Right.
bookmobile would come so we could get our books. So a lot
Okay.
has changed since 1950.
Oh yeah. We although not in the context of Berrien City, we do have a picture of that bookmobile, the probably the same one you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that's somewhere on our website. If you found out about this through Facebook, we you can find it on our Facebook page. I'm sure we posted about it in the past. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's interesting to hear again about the house on North Post because I'd been wondering if it was still around or not.
yeah, it is. I can find out the number for you, let you know.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a couple old ones in the woods there near the Little League fields. I don't know what vintage they were, but they were there when I moved in 73.
Yeah,
And they were on both sides of the road long before the bigger houses were built.
yeah,
In 73, there was really only 4 or 5 housing areas in West Windsor.
Oh yeah, I
Berrien
know.
City, around
Jefferson
surrounding
Park. I
area.
think.
And then there was next to the high school, there was Colonial Park and Jefferson Park,
mhm,
and across from the old Acme, and then I think it was Birchwood or whatever was up near when you go past the Little League fields and up a little more on North Post. That was there then. That was it. There was only 2,800 people then.
Yeah, now it's what, 35,000 or more?
33 last I heard, but we're getting so big now we probably can't count everybody.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know we're almost done, but a little off topic. Just some people may not realize where the big parking lot is. If you're coming from the train station main side over the bridge toward Princeton on the right, that really big lot that they built,
Hmm.
that is built over the old landfill.
yes,
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
people, it was a long time coming because they had to properly close the landfill and all before they could build that
Yeah.
parking lot on that site.
Yeah. The first, I'd say 10 years that I lived here, that's where we took our garbage.
mhm,
Christmas trees, garbage, you name it. They would shred the Christmas trees and you go pick up the chips and use them in your landscape and everything.
Mhm. Yeah, I also vaguely remember that. I'm old enough for that one that I can vaguely remember it. Okay. And any other questions from anyone? Seeing none, I just want to again thank you everyone else for coming. I'm gonna email everyone else, everyone who attended the lecture recording, and we're gonna post it to the website as well and to Facebook. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Yep. Take care. Have a good night.